Welcome everyone to Asialink's webinar, South Korea in Crisis, Domestic Turmoil, Global Implications and the North Korean Threat. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands from which we are all dialing in from and recognize their continuing connection to land, water and community. For me, that is the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. This webinar will be recorded. If you have any questions for the panelists, please use the Q&A function and we will endeavour to answer these towards the end of the session. I am very delighted to introduce our distinguished panel this evening. Please join me in welcoming Professor Andrei Lankov, Professor of Korean Studies at Kookmin University, who is joining us today from Seoul. Also joining us from Seoul, we have Professor Shin-wha, Professor in the Department of Political Science and International Relations at Korea University. Dialing in from Melbourne, we have Dr. Lauren Richardson, lecturer in the Department of International Relations at the Australian National University. Today's panel will be moderated by Dr. Don Greenlees, a Walkley Award-winning journalist and senior advisor to us at Asialink. Don is dialing in from Bangkok today. I'll hand over to you now, Don, to begin the conversation.
Thank you very much, Leah, and thanks to, as you say, our three very distinguished speakers, outstanding scholars on this subject, and they're joining us today from Korea and Melbourne. We also have an audience from around the region, from Australia, South Korea, and elsewhere. And to our audience, a warm welcome. Today's discussion is particularly well timed. Tomorrow, the Constitutional Court in South Korea will hand down its ruling on the impeachment trial of President Yoon Suk-yeol. The decision will determine whether President Yoon can return to the Blue House as president, or whether South Korea faces another long period of leadership uncertainty. Either way, we can expect to see political divisions accentuated in the coming days. And at a difficult time in regional and global geopolitics, South Korea will continue to find itself without strong leadership. I'm sure the outlines of the current crisis are very well known to this audience, so I won't rehash them in detail. But in summary, the immediate trigger came on December 3, when Yoon declared martial law to deal with what he called anti-state forces in the opposition-dominated National Assembly. The martial law decree lasted just 6 hours until it was overturned by legislators. Yoon still faces a separate case of sedition over the failed martial law scheme, and that may continue even if he is acquitted and resumes duties as president tomorrow. Today, we'll explore some of the underlying tensions that prompted this crisis and the way forward for South Korea in the coming months. But we also want to have a look at the international situation. South Korea finds itself dealing with a range of challenges in foreign relations, especially the Trump administration's tariffs announced overnight. Perhaps just as troubling, it needs to factor into the calculations the reliability of its alliance with the US, given Washington's recent track record of ambivalence when it comes to alliances in general. And there is the perennial issue, of course, of nuclear-armed North Korea that has been increasingly flexing its muscles, sending troops and materiel to fight against Ukraine. South Korea also has a history of rocky relations with key neighbours, Japan and China. And despite attempts to improve ties, these relations call for deft diplomacy, and that requires effective national leadership. These countries could become increasingly important in the context of an economically more isolated US. So we'll start the discussion by analysing the domestic political situation and potential scenarios, and then we'll devote the remaining time of our discussion to the international implications of the domestic upheaval. And as Leah said, if you have questions, please put them into the Q&A or chat box, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can towards the end. So to start, I'll turn to you, Shin-wha, and I'd like to get you to run through the scenarios that we face from tomorrow with the Constitutional Court decision. What are the next legal steps arising from the Constitutional Court ruling? What can we expect? So perhaps you could look at this in terms of the two scenarios, impeachment of Yoon or his return to office. But starting with impeachment, what would naturally flow from an impeachment decision by the Constitutional Court?
Okay, well, Don, thank you very much to help me today here. Well, before I just answer you quickly, probably the reason you pick up the date today, April 3rd, is probably you assume we already have outcome. Because we all know the Constitutional Court will deliver the ruling on this presidential impeachment at the latest by the late March, but obviously it's overdue. Is it right?
Yes,
or...
yes. Thinking April Fool's Day. I was thinking April Fool's Day, but anyway.
Right. I thought that's the thing. But interestingly, we will have it tomorrow, so we still have to have a kind of a guesswork, right? So to go to your question, if the Constitutional Court, we only have 8 members now instead of 9, right? Of course, the impeachment, President Yoon will be immediately removed from office, and presidential election must be held according to our constitutional law within 60 days. And during the interim, the acting president, prime minister, now likely Han Duck-soo. I said likely because he is also, again, is at risk of impeachment by the opposition party now. Or another designated figure, if he is impeached, he will be impeached again, will serve as acting president, overseeing a transitional government and the presidential election process itself. So I think this period, I have to say, a vacuum in leadership. But well, we will be in a vacuum in leadership for more than 3 months already. But I think during this process of presidential election, if ever held, I think that will be a serious vacuum in leadership. Particularly, we have to deal with the Trump 2.0. And the critical diplomatic event or security crisis, not to mention of North Korea, but US, Japan, and all other issues has to be on the shelf. So I think that is the big concern. But ruling people power party, Kookmin, will likely face severe internal strife, I think, if the impeachment would take place. With the tension between pro-Yoon versus anti-Yoon factions intensifying, that the party may splinter or experience leadership crisis, I would say. But in the case of Democratic Party led by Lee Jae-myung, I think that Mr. Lee will gain a big political advantage, framing the impeachment as a kind of his victory for constitutional accountability. But as you know, Lee himself has a legal problem, right? Corruption investigation and all other issues. He has to still face the several lawsuits, although he refused to attend there. And very unlikely, but still we have to think about so-called third way or centrist candidates. Because as you may know, now is the far left and far right is very prominent in Korean politics, but I'm sure there are more centrist people are there. So like An Chol-soo or Kim Dong-yeon, and those people could attract growing public support.
If I could come to the candidates in a moment, so we're looking at an election within 60 days if President Yoon is impeached. In the event he's not impeached, what do you see as what is the scenario? He just simply returns to office. He's wounded. Does he hang around for a long period? He's already indicated that he might step aside.
Okay, that remains to be seen, because you remembered in the very last verdict he was mentioning is if he ever come back to power, he said he won stick to his term. He said he will try to reform the constitution and all others. So if President Yoon survives politically, I think still the path ahead is very uncertain. But I think it will be high time to reform the post-1987 constitution that happened after democratization process in 1987. But unless we're making a major breakthrough, like whether through constitutional reform or bipartisan cooperation, I think it will be even difficult for administration to govern properly, if not to mention about effectively. So obviously, we, no matter which side end up tomorrow, definitely we are standing at a crossroad, both domestically and internationally. And I'm as a I'm as a student of international security and relations, I'm really concerned about our foreign and security policy in Korea.
And we will come to that. We will definitely come to that later. President Yoon also faces this insurrection rebellion case, and so he's got a lot at stake in the decision from the Constitutional Court tomorrow.
But if he excuse me,
the
if he
penalties
survives,
are very severe, aren't they, for insurrection?
wait, well, if he survives politically, I think he will be better off position. But if he fail, yeah, the insurrection, the suitcase will be in big trouble. And also the Mrs. Yoon Suk-yeol's case is another hot potato in political arena. No
And
matter
the penalties
which
there, as I understand it, a life imprisonment or the death penalty. So he has that hanging over his head. I'd be amazed if they pursued the latter, but
these days it's very hard to predict in Korean politics, or not even Korean politics, or all other international affairs. But in my opinion, death penalty can be sentenced, but I'm pretty much doubt about whether it will be implemented.
Mm-hmm. Now, Lauren, if I could come to you, you're sort of a bit more of an outsider in this, but you monitor it very, very closely. So maybe you can make sort of braver predictions. But objectively speaking, do you think there are sufficient grounds to impeach Yoon? And how big a test do you think it is for accountability and for democracy? I mean, would it be seen as a particularly bad mark against Korean democracy, given what happened last December, if President Yoon were not to be impeached?
Well, yeah. So firstly, thanks, Don, for hosting this very timely discussion. I think, we should start by looking at the Constitutional Court itself. It's a very interesting court, and it very much grew out of a sense to, really hold, people who are abusing power to account. There were really moves to get this going after Japan's colonization of Korea ended. So it's always been important in that regard. And I first, really became interested in the Constitutional Court when it delivered a formally landmark decision in 2011, which is when former comfort women had sued the Korean government for not working hard enough to pursue compensation from Japan on their behalf. And they won that court case. And that's in part of the reason why we saw a deterioration of relations between Japan and Korea since then. So in terms of Yoon, I think it's also useful to realize that there have been two other presidents in South Korean contemporary political history that have had similar impeachment cases before the court. The first was Roh Moo-hyun, and that was dismissed by the court in 2004. And the second was Park Geun-hye, who, as I think everyone knows, in 2007 was impeached and also later imprisoned. And if we look at what explained the difference between those two cases, it really came down to whether the court believed that those presidents had an active intention to go against the constitutional order. Okay, so in the case of Roh Moo-hyun, they thought he didn't, but in the case of Park Geun-hye, they did. So Yoon has really argued that he's never intended to, fully impose military rule, but it was really just kind of sounding an alarm over what he saw as an abuse of power by the Democratic Party. But we also have some top military and even police officers have come forward saying that Yoon had actually ordered them to pull some of the lawmakers out to block an assembly vote over his decree. So I think I wouldn't be surprised I think that there are legitimate grounds, for impeachment here, and I wouldn't be surprised at all if he did come to meet a similar fate to Park Geun-hye.
So in the broader sense, I mean, do you see this as sort of a significant test for the health of democracy? I mean, you can look at this in two ways, I suppose. I mean, Yoon's actions were seen to be damaging to democracy, but the way the system has kicked in and curtailed you know, the martial law decree, and then has brought about a process of accountability, you'd have to say, you know, Korea has actually managed this crisis reasonably well, wouldn't you?
Yeah, I think it is in some ways a test of democracy, and particularly that's how the court is seen. It's really seen as a bastion of democracy in South Korea. And, you know, if we look at, I was actually in South Korea at the time the martial law was declared for a short conference. And it didn't surprise me to see how quick Korean citizens were to mobilize. And there really is this political culture of accountability and stopping abuse of power. And I think, you know, it's hard to see Yoon's actions in any other light, you know, that he was actually abusing power for his own, you know, political purposes and gain. And I think, you know, we see in South Korea, again, the strong desire to always protect democratic institutions, and also a strong will of citizens, you know, to be part of that process. And I think that's going to be something in the judge's mind, of course, when they rule. I think whichever way they rule, there's going to be upheaval in the country. I think it's, you know, there's going to be people who disagree and agree. But it's certainly very interesting times.
So regardless of the ruling, I mean, are you bracing for a very big upsurge on the street from, you know, the losing side? You know, Koreans are known for fairly robust demonstrations, and I imagine this is something that will inflame passions. So what are you anticipating on the streets as a result of this?
Yeah, I think if the initial martial law, you know, decree was anything to go by, you know, there will be definitely upheaval, some protests on any given day. When you're walking through Korea, you can see some form of protest. It looks very different to Japan in that sense. I think there's obviously probably more support for Yoon's impeachment. So if the court goes against that and, you know, sort of it reinstates him to power, I think we'll see a lot more agitation, civil unrest in South Korea. But yeah, that's definitely something we can expect.
I'd like to bring Andrei in here because, Andrei, I think you've got a somewhat different perspective on the street movement. I mean, we were
Not
discussing.
quite, not
Yeah.
quite, but I would like to attract attention to something new and completely surprising for me. I would not expect it. I would not predict it just a couple of months ago. When the approval rating of the right and Yoon Suk-yeol were about 10% in just immediately after the martial law attempt. Now, as you probably know, they are well over 40%. When I'm pretty sure that indeed chances of impeachment going through the court are quite high, and most likely we are going to see Lee administration for better or worse in near future. Having said that, something important is that the South Korean right has managed to mobilize a very significant popular support. And I see a significant change in the composition of these political activists on the right. Historically, we were talking about old men and women in the 60s and 70s, usually mobilized by churches. What I see now around myself, I saw politicization of young people, overwhelmingly males, people in their 20s and 30s, usually coming for the groups which for the last half a century roughly used to be seen as a major, feeding ground for the South Korean left. Just one case, I know a person who used to be, until later last year, completely, just personally known through some connections, completely apolitical teacher of Hanmun, classical Chinese language, at a high school, writing a PhD on the 17th century Korean novels in Hanmun, definitely, completely non-political. And he now does not miss a single demonstration on the right. He says that the entire impeachment is a conspiracy secretly subsidized by the Chinese spies, that the survival of Korean independence is under threat because Lee Jae-myung and people around him are on payroll of the Chinese Communist Party and its spy services and so on. And again, I'm talking about a person who you would easily encounter in some international conference on the classical culture, and who was as political as possible, and whose parents used to be active participants in the pro-democracy movement in the late 1980s. So is it typical, funny enough, I know another less prominent case of the same instant politicization of a young male. And if you look in his 30s, early 30s, and if you look at the rallies, it's still definitely older than the left. But you see a lot of young faces, and these people are serious. They believe in stuff which is irrational, and it's sometimes, well, frankly, the left-wing propaganda is sometimes, in some parts, is equally comical. A bit like the left used to believe in the threat about the Japanese, Japanese conspiracy and Japan dreaming about taking over Korea, blah, blah, blah. So when I saw the same nonsense being produced by the right, I think that it's a kind of, the left is sometimes paid with its currency, but it doesn't stop to be nonsense, because another topic which is not widely reflected in media, including the right-wing media, is a strong anti-Chinese feelings of pro-Yoon group. They used to believe, many of them, that last elections, I mean general elections, elections in the National Assembly, according to them, were manipulated, elections were unfair. Of course, the vast majority of good Koreans voted for the right. The results were stolen with the help of a group of Chinese hackers. It's conspiracy theory? Yes. Is it a stupid conspiracy theory? Yes. Is it widely believed?
Yes. We're getting this sort of Trump effect in Korean politics
Absolutely.
as well.
No, it's basically, I believe we are dealing with the same kind of flu spreading across the globe, because in some other countries we have the same wild theories. And what is interesting, it's not widely reflected in the right-wing media, because these people are way too smart and responsible. I mean, people like Choson Ilbo and everything, major media outlet, if they write about it, usually just to basically criticize it, to show it's groundless and so on. But on YouTubers, video bloggers, they are spreading this stuff, and this stuff is widely believed, even by the otherwise normal people. Once again, for the balance, I would say, I saw how left-wing activists sincerely believed that the right is subsidized by the Japanese and Japan wants to take over Korea once again. And now they see the same slogans being thrown to them. They're accused of being on the Chinese payroll. Going back to what's likely to happen, I think if impeachment goes through, which seems to be more likely, these people will I don't think they will change the course of change the situation. But right now, because of these young radicals, the right is probably more willing and able to fight back. So it might be, yes, more.
Okay, so on that point, I mean, if I can go around everybody, I mean, if we take your point, and I think most people seem to be leaning in the direction of an impeachment decision tomorrow. Elections, as we've discussed, happening within the next 2 months. How do these elections play out? I got the sense from you, Lauren, that Lee Jae-myung would be favourite to win, or do you think the trends lie with the Liberals, with the Democratic Party, or the more conservative People Power Party?
Yeah, look, the polls do indicate that the opposition leader, the leader of the opposition party, is the favorite to win. I think, there's every reason to believe he will, especially considering the very narrow margin, historically narrow margin by which he lost last time. And now he's cleared from his lawsuits and he's ready to run. I think, yeah, there's every reason to believe that he will be the front runner.
Okay, and Shin-wha, what's your take on that? Do you agree?
All right. I'm not sure whether we are free to talk about to take granted for impeachment today because I'm still a bit confused about the outcome. But anyway, if I can faithfully reply to your question, we have to remember, initially after the martial law took place, even conservatives saw the Yoon's martial law move as a threat to democracy. But over the past 3 months, supporters grew less out of affection for Yoon, but more from fear of Lee Jae-myung in power. So I think we have to remember that. So that's different from the Moon Jae-in's popularity after the Park Geun-hye's impeachment. At that time, Park wasn't that popular, but as Andrei has mentioned, Yoon's popularity is quite high. Actually, it's higher than 40. It's about 46% according to some survey. But once again, it's not affection for Yoon, but it's like some kind of anti-Lee Jae-myung sentiment that was reflected there. Having said that, still, I think we don't have any alternative candidate in Democratic Party because Lee Jae-myung's shade is so large and so dark, or so bright, so that I think not strong enough candidate there to challenge that system. But yesterday, I don't know whether you heard that, whether he will accept the outcome. 3 weeks ago in Channel A TV, he said, well, this is obviously a democratic country and we have no options to accept. But yesterday he said, well, it is, he didn't even put the president, he said just Yoon Suk-yeol. It's Yoon Suk-yeol who should accept, period. So that was a bit even scary to me as well. What kind of strong, super mighty, strong leadership he will try to play throughout the years to come.
And of course, Lee Jae-myung has a number of court cases himself that he has to deal with. One of them was dismissed the other day, but he still has about 4 others that could easily rule him out from running. But I think the expectation is if the elections are held in 60 days, the courts are working at such a pace that he wouldn't get a ruling before then. So it would clear.
If we have, excuse me, Don, if we have more than 3 or 4 or 5 months, I think we will have other candidate coming out. But 2 months is too short. One quick thing, if you allow me to say, if Lee Jae-myung will become a president, I'm afraid we won't be able to fix our chronic problem, that is imperial presence. The reason we need to change the constitution is because we really need to do something different from this kind of omnipotent imperial presidency. Actually, that anyway brought about that very unexpected and very tragic the martial law move 3 months ago.
Yeah, although I'm playing the devil's advocate here a little bit, but did Yoon have some source of grievance? It was very hard for him to get his agenda through. The National Assembly, being controlled by the Democratic Party, blocked everything that he put forward. So the government was sort of in a state of gridlock, in effect.
You mean from Democratic Party or in
from the point of view of the president, from President Yoon? I mean, he struggled to get his agenda through, but and the elections, if they're close, of course, may produce a similar sort of result. There doesn't look like either way we're going to get an overwhelming victory. In other words, we're probably not going to end up with a strong leadership, are we?
Well, as I said, and also as Andrei has mentioned as well, unlike Park Geun-hye's case, Yoon Suk-yeol, that means his team's popularity is pretty high. So if election comes toward Lee Jae-myung's presidency, I think opposition party that not only for the elderly but also younger people who are also supporting the conservative wings, their voice will be very high as well. So unfortunately we will have an internal dispute unless the political party and media and professionals and all others have to get together to think about something different. So to me, I think we really need to reform our constitution. And next president, whomever become a president, he or she should be ready to serve only three years term, so that they will pave the road for next president start having their term under different constitution. And quite a few potential candidates say they are willing to do that, but not Lee Jae-myung. That's why I said if he becomes a president, we will see another like a story of an imperial presidency for South Korean political system, and that will cause another big social and political split.
On the other hand, Andrei, if I'm right, you were suggesting just the other day that it's very hard to see under these circumstances a strong leadership emerging, one that's sort of capable of uniting the country. And of course, it is at a time where strong leadership probably is very desirable.
It's a very sorry situation because we have Trump, we have this perennial North Korean problem, and North Koreans are unusually quiet, but it's probably not going to last. Well, we cannot be sure whether it's going to last. We have Donald Trump and his tariffs, his highly skeptical attitude to any kind of treaty obligations and alliance. We have uncertainty between the United States and Russia. Personally, as a matter of fact, I'm highly skeptical about any kind of armistice in Ukraine in the near future. I don't think it's going to happen. I might be wrong. And we have a Chinese situation, and we need a leadership. And in the current situation, whoever will win, first of all, basically, as Professor Shin has emphasized, it's important, I should say it myself too, but yeah, Lee Jae-myung is very unpopular. He has a strong support base, but outside base, he's unpopular. And as Professor Shin said, a large part of unusually, well, Yoon enjoys a really high support, surprisingly, but to a very large extent, not because people like him, but because they see him as a clearly a lesser evil. And in this situation, whoever is in power, there will be a lot of attacks and quarrels, and people are politicized. Yes, minority. Unlike Park Geun-hye, most Koreans are not involved, but those who are politically active going to be noisy. And as usual, the domestic ideological quarrels will basically take a precedence over the long-term political strategy, including the foreign policy. They will see foreign policy decisions as largely a part of domestic quarrel, which is dangerous but common. And a country might become, I would say, essentially unmaneuverable, uncontrolled, unruled, if you like, even if technically there is somebody at the president's office. Yeah.
So Andrei, you mentioned Donald Trump, and I think that's a good segue for us into issues related to Korea's international relations. And I did want to spend a fair bit of time on this. I thought I'd just go back to Lauren here because I think you've written a little bit about this, Lauren. When Yoon came to office, he had some fairly big foreign policy plans, and he wrote about them in the Foreign Affairs magazine. And just to look at his list of ambitions, he wanted stronger South Korea-US relations, a stronger alliance, a hard line on North Korea, a more principled stance on China's conduct, a strategy for adopting the Indo-Pacific concept, and membership of the Quad. You'd have to say all of that is in tatters, isn't it? I mean, he didn't get very much done in the 2.5 years he had before he was impeached. How do you rate his foreign policy performance, Lauren?
Yeah, well, look, in some ways, I mean, it's commendable that he did manage to sort of improve relations with Japan. I think that's probably his biggest foreign policy achievement, because that relationship was completely in tatters when he came to power, you know.
Ironically, not on his list of ambitions.
I know, right? It's more, and obviously I think that was part of his Indo-Pacific strategy. He thought, because obviously Japan, particularly Prime Minister Abe, was sort of an architect of the Indo-Pacific and its attendant institutions like the Quad. So he thought we need to really get back on track with that. And then he obviously was instrumental in part in the Camp David Trilateral Summit Pact and was willing to get in that. So I guess that did help relations with the US in many ways. And that's also why I think when Yoon was impeached or when he declared martial law, we saw a lot of silence from both the US and Japan, particularly because a lot of this, the sort of achievements he'd had in regard to them were at stake. And I think they have been severely undermined with not just his impeachment by the National Assembly, but also because Japan's had changes in leadership, and also now Trump has come to power. So if we do see, he's the opposition leader, coming to power, we could actually see that a lot of those achievements really don't come to much at all. We can expect that trilateral exercise, might really start to dwindle. Okay, but at the same time, Don and I did work on with Anthony Milner at Asialink a report on the rules-based order, and this was a 2023 publication, and we predicted in that South Korea will need to work with other middle powers like Australia in the face of the efforts of both China and the US to really undermine the rules-based order. And one of the agendas for cooperation that we outlined, and I think Leah is going to post a link to that, was this opportunity for South Korea to actually be working harder with Australia to strengthen economic security and the multilateral rules-based trading order in the Indo-Pacific. And that might have been a better agenda for Yoon rather than this trilateral exercise with Japan and the US, which is vulnerable to many forces. One interesting thing I will say is that we're already seeing, despite what's happening with Yoon, and despite, really because of Trump's rise to power for a second term, is the beginnings of trilateral economic momentum between China, Japan, and South Korea. That could be one of the really interesting things to watch, if that's something that's going to be driven by Trump's actions and unilateral tariffs that he's imposing. I think that's going to be something very interesting.
I might come back to some of those themes in a minute, Lauren, but just switch over to Andrei for this. And one of the immediate, big challenge would seem to be dealing with the US administration, and particularly the tariff decision that was announced overnight. And as far as I'm aware, no senior Korean has had any opportunity to talk to Donald Trump about it. So this is a terrible liability not to have a confirmed president in the job. I believe the acting presidents Han Duck-seo and Chae Sang-mok have not spoken to the White House. How significant is this as a handicap to Korea putting its case in the big tariff debate?
Massive, I would say. Because when you are dealing with Donald Trump, especially the second edition of Donald Trump, the second term Donald Trump, it's not about institutions. It's largely about personal interaction. And institutional stuff, especially because he deeply distrusts the state, the bureaucracy, maybe with some reasons, because bureaucracy doesn't like him. All these interactions are not going to help. So country should have a leader. And if the leader is, and the more authoritarian, the more unchanged the leader, the better for Donald Trump. Xi Jinping, good. Vladimir Putin, wonderful. Kim Jong-un, what can be better? And South Korea cannot produce anybody like that in the foreseeable future. And this is a problem because Trump, who, well, dislikes all American allies, well, many of them, he has special vitriol for South Korea, but it would be possible probably to please him by, using this usual kind of being flattering and negotiating some concessions. But who is going to do it? I don't see anybody in Korea who will be taken sufficiently seriously by Donald Trump and his inner circle, sufficiently serious to be talked to. So, yeah.
But what do you think this means for the strength of the alliance in general, Andrei? I think actually it was Shin-wha said to me on the phone the other day that that the bedrock of the alliance was reliability. And how do you see the tariff decision, the economic decisions playing out and affecting the alliance more broadly, including the security dimensions?
I think that right now South Koreans can do very little, partially because, well, even under best circumstances, they would be unable to do much. But especially now, when they, as I have said, rudderless, without basically anybody on the commands on the bridge of this ship. But I think that it's another blow to the credibility of the United States. And the South Korean right, who has basically believed firmly with, who has had unwavering trust in the United States and alliance, is sort of shocked. They just hope that it's going to pass, that it's enough to survive until the end of Donald Trump's presidency, and that it will be forgotten and everything. Well, but it's a bit of naive expectations, but what else can they do? So yes, the decline of belief in the United States is certain, decline of trust is certain, but then we'll ask one question. Well, United States should not be trusted. So who can be trusted? And there are no candidates, no alternative. Nobody in the right mind is talking now about, say, China replacing the United States or whoever else. So they don't see any alternatives. They will try to close eyes on pretty much everything America is going to do, hoping that A, it will be just a short period experience. B, they don't see any alternative. However, having said that, Donald Trump has already damaged seriously the trust in the United States, and damage will last for years and years, maybe even for decades, even if his policy will disappear, and this is a big if.
So, Shin-wha, if I could get your views on this, and once the tariffs start to bite, and we see significant economic losses. I mean, the OECD is already writing down growth in 2025 by 0.6%. There are real fears about layoffs. The United States is the biggest market for Korean autos. It's probably on a par with China in terms of the size of exports, sort of equal number one. When the economic impacts start to bite, do you see a significant backlash against the United States? And we've had plenty of these in the past, but do you think this could be a more profound backlash?
Well, let me put it this way. They charge 25% on South Korea, while 24% in Japan. So some newspapers start to say why there are 1% difference. Well, that what I'm saying is we are that sensitive about those tariffs, right? But I think we have a significant and even fundamental impact on alliance, because the alliance, although we began with a military alliance like 7, 8 years ago, but that was expanded to larger alliance framework that we can just share so many things, including economy, not only military economy, but also value and norms, right? But President Trump kind of has ushered in an era of, I would say, aggressive, conflictual protectionism. And he even called that Liberation Day policy, right? So that kind of protectionist, ultra protectionist stance has strained relation with key allies, as we all know. but in particular in Korea, imposition of tariff on South Korea and the middle power, I think that seriously bring us to rethink about American century and also Kinderberger trap. What I'm saying for Kinderberger trap to begin with, like in the absence of stabilizing global leader, right? Not only economic instability can ensue, as we see in 1930s Great Depression, if those superpowers didn't play appropriate leadership by providing global common goods, that will have a repercussion to their own countries as well. So I think although Trump is so focused and so busy to only thinking about their own interest, I'm sure they will definitely have a like a boomerang effect. And also remember that American century, of course, there was interest by Henry Luce during the 20th century, but Joseph Nye from Harvard said American century is not declined because leadership is not only measured by power, but by the willingness to take the responsibility for the global commons. But obviously now under the Trump's US, lose, I think, both. I think that will having a big fundamental change, not to mention of a very typical theory of international relations. Today's friends can be easily become tomorrow's enemy or vice versa. So we cannot trust anybody, right? But if done, so that having said that, if I can briefly touch upon that the scenario for President Yoon's impeached is on, and then but the President Yoon is so much valued for bilateral alliance with the U.S. and also the U.S. Korea-Japan trilateral cooperation under the name of Camp David, right? And those things I think has to be redirected, not from within, but also from outside. So I'm not sure what kind of alliance or virtual alliance we can build up will be pretty challenging for at least in the near future, at least for the direction of the South Korean foreign policy.
Mm. Now, time is getting away from us, as it always does with these discussions, and I want to get into North Korea. So I think we'll just switch gears and delve into North Korea a little bit. And I'll stay with you, Shin-wha. There's been sort of considerable speculation over what Donald Trump might do with North Korean diplomacy. I think some people think that, he may well try to entertain a repeat of the summit diplomacy that he had with Kim Jong-un. But given what has happened in Ukraine, how worried are South Koreans that the US president might do a deal, over something like a peace treaty or drawdown or withdrawal of US forces that doesn't take account of South Korean interests? Is that a profound worry for Korean officialdom?
Well, we worry about it because the current geopolitical situation, even before Trump came back, those great power library and everything has kind of give a big leverage to North Korea in many ways, right? And particularly the U.S. friction with Russia give more room, strategic room for North Korea to maneuver. So before Trump came in, Russia and North Korea rebuild their military alliance, right? By the way, that military alliance kind of broke down when South Korea and Russia made a normalization process in 1991. And then they just rebuilt this time, right? So now whatever they're doing, like sending the troops or just helping them for military things or vice versa, is under the name of their official alliance. So I think that's pretty dangerous. But so that now the Trump came in and Trump wants to reconcile with Russia and North Korea. I think that even give a better position for North Korea strategically. So at least up to now, since Trump was too busy with other things, so he didn't touch upon the North Korea officially, although he say this and that in here and there. Denuclearization is still the U.S. Official policy toward North Korea. But given what we saw about the Trump's behavior over the past 2 months, I wouldn't be that much surprised if he changed to focusing on arms reduction rather than denuclearization in order to have another summit with Kim Jong-un. But if he's doing that, and also in that process he like bypassed the my country, South Korea, I think that will definitely cross the South Korea's security red line. So already 75% of South Korean public, according to the survey, is in favor of our own the nuclear weapon acquisition. But I think if that kind of a thing happen again, the survey will be even bigger and stronger voice for that.
Aside from surveys, those red lines, they're red lines that are in the minds of senior Korean officials, right? And do you think that represents a trigger for South Korea, not just reflected in opinion surveys, but in policy thinking? Do you think that is a tipping point for South Korea to consider acquiring nuclear weapons itself?
Yes and no, because definitely we already have a tipping point. But there are controversies over whether we have to have it or not. But as an officials, I think they always be cautious because they will having even bigger negative consequences then, so that it might be better off for us not to have it, but to have. But if that happens, and I think it's really up to who's become the leader. If conservative wing somehow win, I think they will be more closely coordinate with the US, so that they want to be a bit more prudent and more cautious. And if Liberal Party who wants to make a balance with the US and China, take the power, still I think they want to be cautious, not only think about their relation with the US, but also I'm sure that China will strongly oppose it as well. So surrounded by these big powers, as an official or as a political leader, I think it will be a very tough choice to get it. But let's say if the 99% of Korean public would like to be nuclear armed, then I think a political leader has not much choice but to take that as a tipping point. But as of now, it might be that easy decision to easy choice for us to make.
But at that point, you envisage it might be bipartisan.
Again, usually the politics should stop at the water's edge. But in case of Korea, unfortunately, we have each party was bundling up their own political agenda and not only cross the water's edge, but also try to selling their own business for their own political gain. So I don't know how I can answer it, but at the point of a nuclear armed thing happens, I think a political leader has to make some bipartisan efforts. Otherwise, I think we will be in a big strategic.
I mean, there have been some mixed messages. I noted that Foreign Minister Cho Tae-yul said just the other day that every option was on the table. So it looks like there are still some mixed messages, and Yoon had initially floated it but walked back from it. Andrei, I mean, even a few days ago in Japan, when we had the foreign ministers of Korea, Japan, and China meeting, the official policy from the Japanese and the Koreans, I think, was for complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Is that a realistic basis for policy? I know you've had some views on this. You've written about this.
For 20 years. For 20 years, I have been repeating, no, it's completely unrealistic. North Koreans are not going to surrender their nuclear weapons as long as the Kim family stays in power, or perhaps much longer. Because even the regime change in North Korea, if it remains an independent state, will not necessarily produce denuclearization. But Kim family is likely to stay in power for the foreseeable future, so it's not going to happen and has never, ever been possible. Talks about denuclearization on the North Korean side were ways to win time. They were willing to stop their nuclear program, but they have seen what happened in Libya, and they see what happened in Ukraine, and they are not going to become number 3. We can put even number 4 before, because Iraq also under Saddam used to have nuclear development and weapons acquisition program, which was destroyed by an Israeli Air Force raid in the early 1980s. So no amount of guarantees. After all, Libya got it, Ukraine got it, and the results. So completely unrealistic. And all this talks about, wow, it's so terrible. Now the United States are not talking about denuclearization anymore. They even calling North Korea nuclear power. Sorry, North Korea has delivery systems, ICBMs, even some primitive ballistic missiles armed submarines. They have few dozen nuclear warheads. What is it? What is it but a nuclear armed state? And last time I checked, the US Congress and even US Senate has no power to rewrite laws of ballistics and nuclear physics. So no matter what they say, it's not going to change reality. They can repeat it as much as they like.
It's hard to estimate from the tests, but the view that, and you expressed this to me recently, that the North Korea can hit the west coast of the United States.
Yeah. Full ICBM is questionable because they never tested it on the real trajectory, low angle trajectory, and it's not clear whether they have a re-entry vehicle. But they definitely have easier delivery systems, which are probably capable to hit West Coast, definitely capable of hitting Guam and Alaska. And of course, nobody doubts about their ability to hit Japan or any point within South Korea with a powerful nuclear strike. So they again a nuclear power, no matter what is said or not said by some officials in some remote country.
Yeah. I've got a couple more questions for you on this, Andrei, but I just want to say to Lauren, feel free to jump in, Lauren, if you've got a particular view to put on this. I didn't have a specific question, but if you've got something to say. But another question that interests me is the US nuclear umbrella and deterrence, and your views on how effective the nuclear deterrent is in protecting South Korea.
Nobody knows. But recently, last year, Mr. Colby, currently appointed Assistant Secretary, I'm not sure about the exact titles, Under Secretary of Defense in the United States, in charge of the political matters, or explicitly said that South Korea should not count on the North Korean nuclear umbrella in the new situation when North Koreans are able or soon will be able to deliver a nuclear strike to San Francisco or, say, even New York City. And given the current trend of, say, current mindset of Donald Trump's administration, I don't see how Americans will risk San Francisco or, Florida to save Seoul. So generally, I think that nuclear umbrella is not that reliable, because when the idea was created, we were talking about areas like Europe with a very high strategic value, and Korea is not seen in the United States as something as important, as Germany back in 1955. So my short answer is I'm quite skeptical. Nobody knows for sure, and nobody will learn until the very last moment, but I'm skeptical.
And I presume the South Koreans are especially skeptical themselves. But if they are so skeptical that they might feel the need to acquire their own nuclear weapon, what are the technical impediments? What is the feasibility, and how quickly would it take? Would they be able?
Yeah, they have money, they have technology. They have done somewhat dubious and suspicious experiments with weapon-grade plutonium and later with highly enriched uranium.
That was back in
So
2000, right? That was
yes, well, with plutonium, it was in the early 1980s. With HEU, it was in 2000, but it became a public knowledge in 2004.
2004.
Having said that, I'm pretty sure they think about, well, I know they think about it. Popular support is overwhelming, roughly 2/3, and it has been stable. I believe in no other non-nuclear country, the average man or woman on the street likes the idea of going nuclear as much as in South Korea. The elite has been traditionally skeptical. There were people in the military like Chon and-bo, in the academia like Chon Son-jan, and so on in the politics who were supportive. But until recently, it was seen as unnecessary, risky, difficult, major problems. First, fissile material. North Korea is sitting on its own deposits of uranium, and they have nuclear reactors which are not controlled by any other country, so they can A, produce highly enriched uranium, B, they can produce weapon-grade plutonium without anybody's control. South Korea is different. Basically, all their fuel rods used in their numerous power stations basically are under the American control. They cannot proceed it. They don't have uranium. They are dependent on basically exports of uranium, and given the level of international control, it will be impossible to use it for full-scale nuclear weapons acquisition program. And they also cannot proceed fuel rods. They have physically, they are located partially inside Korea because of the agreements from the 1970s with the United States. So it means that without implicit or explicit agreement of the United States, they cannot get fissile material to go nuclear. So, well, if Washington does not give approval, it will be extremely difficult or impossible. Second issue is political. It's not enough to persuade Washington. Once there will be signs about South Korea going nuclear, it will become very vulnerable because North Korea might deliver a preliminary strike, and they will be vulnerable again exactly at the time between decision is made and sort of leaked, and it will be leaked, you can be sure it's Korea, and the time when they get first deployable weapons, which will take maybe a year or 2 or 3. And during this time, US nuclear umbrella is the only protection. It's number 2, and number 3, China, because China is deadly afraid of nuclear domino. South Korean nukes will be followed by Japanese nukes, maybe Vietnamese nukes, Malaysian nukes, Myanmar nukes, and Taiwanese nukes, and so on, all of them aimed at China. So, and China has, well, basically it's nearly 30% of all foreign trade. Embargo by China is going to be a very heavy hit. So politically and technically it's difficult. And even though majority here wants nuclear weapons, they don't fully realize how expensive and dangerous it's going to be. Nonetheless,
Sorry. Well, technically, practically, it's difficult, but also legally, I think we have to make a big political breakthrough or diplomatic breakthrough with the US as well, because in the case of Japan, 87 or 88, the US and Japan signed the nuclear cooperation agreement granting that the consensus for reprocessed spent nuclear fuel and enriched uranium, right? But unlike Japan, in our case, 2015 or so, US-South Korea Civil Nuclear Cooperation Agreement does not grant our country such consent. So that requires case-by-case approval for enrichment and reprocessing activities from US side. So I think it's extremely difficult for us to make a deal with Trump for now. It's 1, 2, 3 agreement.
Mm.
So,
And
so
Lauren,
we have to overcome the legal issues as well.
And Lauren, you know the Japanese situation particularly well. Do you think it is so automatic that Japan would follow suit under that scenario?
I don't think it's automatic. It's definitely going to raise voices in Japan. There's going to be more voices in political circles, calling for that. I think that would be a natural consequence. But there are much bigger kind of domestic impediments in Japan because of the strong anti-nuclear movement and the activity around Hiroshima. We've just had the former President Kishida was very anti-nuclear. There are much stronger anti-nuclear voices in Japan, and having been the only country, obviously, to have been nuked, and not once but twice historically, I think that's a major difference. But certainly there would be, I think, a big push to acquire nuclear weapons in Japan as well. And who knows, Trump could even push that.
Clearly, the US State Department is worried because in January, the US Energy Department is worried. They added South Korea to the list of sensitive countries, along with China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea when it came to sharing information about nuclear issues. So the Americans don't seem to be enthusiastic about the risk of proliferation. So look, we're coming up to the end of our time here, and there are a couple of questions in the chat box. So I think we've in some ways covered some of this, but there's a question I might just put to you here, Andrei, and that is whether China can take advantage of this particular geopolitical climate. And I mean, one of the things we talked about the other day, Andrei, was if the United States becomes an unreliable ally, the only country that can really restrain North Korea is China. And it would make sense objectively for South Korea to be doing its best to develop warm relations with Beijing in order to have that restraint on North Korea strengthened. But you had some views on that, about the costs that perhaps would have to be paid in order to South Korea to achieve that.
I would say there are two serious obstacles. First of all, the majority of the South Korean political class is pro-American, even their position, though conservatives sometimes accuse opposition of being anti-American or something like that. It's not the case. They feel very comfortable within Pax Americana. They have lived within Pax Americana for 75 years. And they don't want to go to Pax Sinica because it will be unfamiliar and potentially dangerous. And probably they are right, because we simply don't know how China will control its kind of, well, security sphere of influence, like it, name it as you like, because, well, so for a long time it has never had such a sphere. But it's most likely that they're going to be quite harsh, especially when it comes to the economic issues. And it's going to produce, well, if, say, China has a sort of, provide some security for South Korea, they will be very demanding on the economic issues related to the trade and economy, and South Koreans are not going to like it. And let's also keep in mind, let's not forget about both Korea and especially China being very nationalistic. All these clashes about who has invented kimchi and to whom an ancient state Koguryo, whose basically only words from Koguryon language are ancient Japanese, by the way. Don't trust me? Don't believe me? Please check what linguists write about what is known about Koguryo. It seemingly was, at least to a very large part, neither Chinese nor Korean. But having said that, this clashes is just another reminder of kind of very tradition-based local nationalism and very little East Asian solidarity, very little East Asian solidarity. It will be more painful for the, because of actual factor, because of historical factor, cultural factor, everything, for South Koreans to deal with China. Let's never forget that North Korea, in spite of dealing with China for being under sort of Chinese protection and control for 70 years, strongly dislike China. They would prefer Russians, who are sort of outsiders to the region, to the Chinese, and it has been the case for a long time.
Yeah. Meanwhile, North Korea is acquiring a range of capabilities, including experimenting with low-yield nuclear weapons that only have one purpose, and that is to intimidate and blackmail the South, right?
Yeah.
So they're in a bit of a vice in the South, that the price that you have to pay for security, whichever way you go, could be quite high. The alternative is to be blackmailed. All right.
And this is because the situation is getting dangerous, not immediately, but as you have mentioned, it's good that you raise this issue. North Koreans, if they are going to develop tactical nuclear weapons, and they keep talking about it, the only goal is for these weapons is to be used against South Korea in case of conflict. It will seriously undermine or neutralize the South Korean superiority in the conventional weapons, and it's going to be a big problem.
All right. Well, look, we've run over time. It was a very stimulating discussion, everyone. Thank you so much. Probably I tried to bite off too much, I think, because there's a lot of ground to cover. But thank you all so much. You've done a terrific job. And I'll hand back to you, Leah, and you can do the honors.
Thank you, Don.
I think your microphone might be off, Leah.
Whoops, sorry about that, guys. Thank you, Don. And on behalf of Asialink and our audience, I would like to thank the panel. Andrei, Shin-wha, and Lauren, thank you for sharing your insights with us today. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in. We hope to see you at another Asialink webinar in the future. And good evening. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And nice
Thank
meeting
you
you,
for
Lauren and
inviting.
Andrei. Hopefully we
lovely
can
to
keep
see
in
you.
touch. Yeah, we can keep in touch.
Thank you, Don.
Thank you.
Okay,
Yes.
thank you, Don. Bye for now.
Keep in touch.
Yeah, bye.